I am going to issue our notification of intent to withdraw from the Trans-Pacific Partnership, a potential disaster for our country. Instead, we will negotiate fair bilateral trade deals that bring jobs and industry back onto American shores.
Notice from President-elect Donald Trump that as a day one priority, the US will be abandoning the TPP. A huge blow to what was set to be the biggest free trade deal in history. The Trans-Pacific Partnership Agreement brought together 12 countries that make up around 40% of the world's economy. The deal includes cutting tariffs and creating standards in industries like pharmaceuticals, farming and travel. It was signed last year, but still needs to be ratified by the individual countries. But opposition to the TPP has been loud and widespread, with many concerned it will simply empower corporations, erode democracy, and stifle competition. The TPP played a big part in the US presidential election, with Donald Trump and Bernie Sanders vehemently opposing it.
It continues a trend
Of disastrous trade deals.
But TPP supporters say it will create new, better jobs and stronger economic growth, and that leaving is a mistake.
China, 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 China.
A key part of Trump's campaign rhetoric was that when it comes to trade, the US is losing to China, and leaving the TPP is the first step to turning that around. But is backing out of the deal actually opening another door for China? The 11 other member countries are still pushing the deal through, but without the US, it has shrunk dramatically.
The TPP would be meaningless without the United States.
We believe that it is an important strategic commitment by the United States, but of course the new administration and the new Congress have got to make their own assessment.
Without the US, the Asian and Pacific bloc could look to bring in new members, including China. Or other free trade deals with China could start to look more appealing. Will leaving the TPP help boost America's economy and help it win the global trade race? Or is abandoning free trade with Asia and the Pacific something it will regret? Yvette McCullough, The Newsmakers.
Well, joining me now from Washington, D.C. is Peter Morici. He's an economist and professor of business at the University of Maryland. Also in Washington, D.C. is Robert Manning. He's a resident senior fellow at the Atlantic Council's Brent Scowcroft Center on International Security. Gentlemen, thank you very much for joining us. Peter Morici, let me start with you. What does this decision tell you about President-elect Donald Trump and what his economic policies will be like?
Well, it's one piece of a jigsaw puzzle when it comes to Trump's economic policies. On the one hand, he has within his administration or emerging administration advocates of old-fashioned supply-side economics, Republican economics, tax cuts, deregulation, and so forth. And they are very ambivalent about this movement away from free trade. On the other hand, there are people like Steve Bannon who fancy themselves as economic nationalists, although they really haven't defined that adequately. And they are very skeptical about these trade agreements. I have to say that the Obama trade policy gave them good reason for that skepticism. For example, they negotiated a free trade agreement with South Korea, which is, I consider, kind of like the trial run of TPP. And it turned out very badly for the United States over the last 5 years, terribly badly. So it's important for them to be skeptical and to get this thing right. You have to remember that even mainstream companies like the Ford Motor Company, which is very international and has factories all around the world and it's expanding in Russia when the rest of the United States is pulling back, are very skeptical of the TPP. But merely pulling out completely leaves a void, which the Chinese can easily step into. I mean, do we want China defining the rules in Asia? I don't think so. And with the Philippines' recent pivot on security matters towards China, this is going to make life much more difficult for foreign policy architects inside the Trump
let's bring in Robert
administration.
Manning. Let's ask Robert Manning, is this a good idea or a bad idea? Are we going from pivot to Asia to hand over Asia to China?
Well, first of all, I think you have to step back and understand that the presidential campaign was extraordinarily free of facts. And I think what we're already seeing is as Donald Trump starts getting briefed with facts, he's walking back from a lot of his positions. So I have that caveat. Having said that, I think withdrawing from TPP would mark a kind of inflection point of the whole U.S. post-Cold War role in Asia. It would take the U.S. It would prejudice Asian markets against U.S. businesses, market access, and allow China to move. There are 147 trade agreements already in Asia. They're moving forward on alternatives. And if the U.S. pulls out, it would leave free hand for China on trade. And perhaps worse, I think it sows doubt in the mindset of Asians about U.S. durability in Asia,
right,
which will have could have a huge impact on our security role.
Robert, Trump seems to disagree. He says, instead of TPP, we will negotiate fair bilateral trade deals that bring jobs and industry back onto American shores. Why are you not that confident that he's right?
Well, first of all, he's pretty ignorant. We already have free trade deals with Canada, with about 6 of the 11 other members of TPP. I do think there's a possibility that could be interesting of a U.S.-Japan free trade agreement because TPP was really, in effect, a kind of a backdoor U.S.-Japan free trade agreement. Those two economies make up about 80% of the whole TPP economy. And Japan made concessions in TPP it would have never made in bilateral talks. So starting from that basis, I think it's quite possible, and I've already heard Japanese officials hinting at this, that we may see a U.S.-Japan FTA, which would mitigate the damage. But I think there's a larger problem because President Obama portrayed TPP as a foundation of his whole so-called rebalance to Asia. Mm-hmm. So if you pull that away, it unravels the whole U.S. role and raises a lot of questions in the minds of many Asians who depend on U.S. security guarantees, which has been key to stability in the region for 70 years.
Right. Peter, Senator John McCain has been vocally and vociferously against this decision over the past 24 hours. He's been outspoken. Has he made any fair points, or do you think it's just personal between him and Trump, and it's just because he's against Trump?
Oh, I don't think it's strictly personal. It's easy to characterize a lot of what goes back and forth in these transitional days as being personal. And people slip into rhetoric which betrays their objectivity. For example, calling Donald Trump ignorant doesn't do an analyst much good in terms of his credibility, but with anyone with a liberal media that's very much opposed to him. He has to be cognizant of the fact that there's a trade agreement with Canada and Mexico if he's going to rip it up. I don't advocate that either. My feeling is that there are a lot of fair points to be made against the decision to merely rip up or walk away from TPP. I wrote an op-ed on Monday in the Washington Times that said the trick here is to get it right. However, Mr. Obama has a terrible track record at negotiations in Asia. And if you look at where the United States stood in Asia 8 years ago and where it stands today, it's a greatly diminished position with allies basically deserting the ship. It's possible to negotiate bilaterals which would be more accommodating to U.S. interests and mutually advantageous to both sides. But it's very difficult for me to see how, and when we talk about bilaterals, those of us who are critical of TPP, Mr. Manning, are not ignorant to the fact that we have a trade agreement with Australia and that New Zealand wants one too. We're not ignorant to that. And words like ignorant don't serve your purposes very well, sir.
So let's get Robert Manning's response.
To negotiate by, hold on. I want to finish my thought.
Finish your thought.
Okay? It is possible to negotiate bilaterals, but then what does that leave to the relationships among those countries? it's very difficult to negotiate bilaterals in a way that would be truly competitive with something that China would offer, which would encompass Indonesia, Malaysia, Vietnam, the players inside of Pacific Asia beyond Japan.
Okay.
That's what this agreement is really about.
Okay, but I don't think Robert was calling you ignorant. He was
Now, Mr. Manning, I hope you'll use this opportunity to withdraw the phrase ignorant.
Okay, but he was calling Trump ignorant. He wasn't referring to you. But Robert, you want to tackle that?
All you have to do is go back and look at what he said during the campaign. If you've got a better word than ignorant, I'd like to hear it. Having said that, I don't
No, but
think
to
he's
say
a
that he was
stupid
ignorant
man,
to the
and I
fact that
think
we have free trade agreements was absurd. I think that's absurd.
I didn't say that.
I ask you to refrain from the use of language like that. If Hillary Clinton were president-elect and I referred to her as ignorant, the Atlantic Council would be standing on his head and screaming that Maurici was a sore loser and a protectionist.
Okay,
Try to find better language, sir.
What does this have to do with trade agreements?
Okay,
this is ridiculous.
Robert, you want to pick that up and clarify, if you want to clarify, or take that further? Go ahead, Robert.
Look, I think there's a lot of things that have been said about TPP that really didn't get. Nobody ever talked about the content. I mean, there are problems with it that I think could be fixed, but I think in terms of the emerging sectors that it opens up in digital commerce, in IPR protection, in the services sector where the U.S. is extremely competitive and runs a surplus, actually, all those things would be a big advantage for U.S. business and would strengthen our economic position in Asia. And unless you've got I haven't heard anybody explain how we're better off without it when the rest of Asia is moving towards a whole range of multilateral agreements that are going to deny market access for American companies.
Peter, I'm most fascinated by the internal dynamics here where Robert says, a lot of people don't know what TPP is about. Those who were flagging up what some of the details were generally activists on the left, were generally the Bernie Sanders type supporters in the past, say, 18 months to a year, saying this is bad, corporations will be able to sue governments in secret tribunals, big pharma, big tobacco, these people are gonna take everybody else to the cleaners. So the irony would be, Peter, would you agree that if the president-elect was Hillary Clinton and she had to announce this, there would have been those on the left who would have said, finally Clinton is listening to the Bernie Sanders supporters. Finally Clinton's listening to those further on the left.
Well, I think that a lot of the people on the left that have been very, very critical of the TPP are basically people who are financed by organized labor and don't want any kind of free trade agreement. So what they do is they take some aspects of TPP and demagogue them. For example, it's standard, in the WTO, for example, when we have a dispute, a tribunal in Geneva determines the outcome of the dispute. It's not determined in a U.S. court or a Swiss court or an Argentine court with whomever we're having the dispute. And there's nothing particularly unique about having dispute settlement inside a TPP. But to say secret international tribunals will subvert American courts is great for getting people aroused and, frankly, for getting the people at the New York Times to write favorable articles about you. And I think that's really terrible. The basic arguments in favor of the TPP are that it would create a lot of opportunities for American companies in areas where we, don't do as well as we should, because the barriers are not tariffs, but rather regulatory requirements inside of these various countries. And I'm all in favor of taking those down and pursuing agreements that would affect that. However, that was the same argument used with regard to the U.S.-Korea agreement. And yet, the trade deficit, including services, has turned dramatically against us with Korea, costing us over 100,000 jobs. The real problem is that you have to give as well as take in trade agreements, and Mr. Obama tends to negotiate terribly unbalanced deals. So this agreement has to be rebalanced. I doubt that Hillary Clinton would have thrown it out the window. She has more sensitivity to the various elements of international diplomacy that are involved here, and that we have security interests in Asia, as well as whether there are jobs in Reading, Pennsylvania. Unfortunately, there's a tendency to see Donald Trump in terms of black and white. And if you're on the extreme left and you don't really like anybody who ever voted for a single Republican, or you're against free trade completely, everything that Donald Trump does will be criticized as demagogic, ignorant, and so forth.
Okay.
In reality, this is a very complex deal, and we need to analyze what's wrong with it to make it right.
Okay.
And
I'm
I
running
would
out of time,
suggest
Peter.
we need to move from
I don't
there.
mean to interrupt you, and I apologize, but I need to get a final word in from Robert because we are out of time. Robert,
Sure.
can you agree with Peter that Hillary Clinton would not have done this, and this is the first real mark that we're seeing from a Trump presidency that would single him out as being different?
I'm not persuaded that Hillary Clinton would have done any different regarding TPP. The real problem to me is that the role of trade in relation to jobs is misunderstood. Yes, we lost a couple of million jobs in the 1990s to China when they became our manufacturing hub. But the future of jobs is going to be shaped by robotics and artificial intelligence and automation. And so people talk about bringing manufacturing back to the U.S. Manufacturing is at a 30-year high, but the jobs aren't there because it's all automated. And so I think we need that. We're having the wrong debate about trade. We should be thinking, how do you prepare a 21st century labor market for 21st century jobs?
So I think that's going to be a good show topic for us to have.
About.
I think it's a good show topic for us to have. Hopefully we'll have you two on again. How do we prepare jobs for the 21st century market? Fascinating question, gentlemen. Unfortunately, we are out of time for this segment. Robert and Peter, it's been a pleasure. All the best.